Hello, everyone. Today we will be learning about the counterculture of the 1960s. The 1960s were a unique time in American history. In the 1960s, we see the Vietnam War, a rise in social and political activism, and an overall move away from the streamlined ideals of the 1950s. So, what is counterculture, you may ask? Counterculture is defined as a way of life and a set of attitudes opposed to or at variance with the prevailing social norm. So when we're talking about the 1960s counterculture, we're referring to the move away from the conservatism and the consumer culture of the 1950s. The idea that the ideal family lived in the suburbs, that the mother stayed at home with the children, and that the father was the head of the household and sole provider. In the 1950s, we see the television become a household staple, and door-to-door salesmen became commonplace. Think Mad Men. The counterculture of the 1960s completely breaks away from this. The ideal family life in the suburbs is no longer the central focus, and we see young people questioning government authority and embracing individuality over conformity. One of the main elements of 1960s counterculture is protest culture. In the 1960s, we see young people embracing political and social causes, calling for justice and equality by taking action in the form of protests, boycotts, and sit-ins. There were movements for human rights. In the 1960s, we see the women's rights movement, led by organizations like NOW. We see the environmental movement, inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which exposed the dangerous damage humans were doing to the environment and to themselves. We also see the Chicano movement, led by organizations like MALDEF and Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. And of course, we see the civil rights movement in the 1960s, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael, and organizations like the Black Panthers and the NAACP. We also see the growth of Native American rights organizations, like the National Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement, demanding that the federal government take responsibility for and return lands that were taken when the government forcibly relocated Native Americans in the 19th century. We also see anti-war protests against the Vietnam War, the first war that everyday Americans were exposed to due to the commercialization of televisions. These social justice and political causes were overwhelmingly embraced by the youth of the 1960s, as we see activism on college campuses and political action being led and supported by young Americans. Many of the causes and issues we see in the 1960s are still relevant in today's America, as questions of racial and gender equality and violence and climate change are still major points of debate on a national scale. Another major aspect of 1960s counterculture is music. In the 1960s, popular artists were not only musical artists, but they were also activists who used their music as a medium with which to spread their message. We have artists like Joan Baez, who was active in multiple political and social movements and wrote about them in her music. We have artists like Jimi Hendrix, who openly embraced the ideals of the counterculture, most recognizably the drug culture, which would ultimately lead to his death. We also have artists like Bob Dylan, whose The Times They Are Changin' is one of the most iconic and recognized songs of the 1960s, a reflection on the changing social and political landscape in America that was being brought about by the counterculture. Additionally, with artists like Baez and Hendrix, we see Americans embracing artists of color on a national scale. Baez's father was from Mexico, and Hendrix was one of Native American and African American descent. And of course, one of the most iconic moments of the 1960s for music and the counterculture was Woodstock. Held in August of 1969 on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York, Woodstock was originally expecting only 50,000 attendees, but Woodstock eventually saw over 500,000 people come to the festival over the course of 3 days. Woodstock's purpose can be seen in the way it was advertised. Woodstock, an Aquarian experience, 3 days of peace and music. The festival brought 32 major acts, including Jimi Hendrix, The Who, and the Grateful Dead, all in the name of spreading peace and unity, in a decade marked by instability and uncertainty. And a quick side note and fun fact, my father actually attended Woodstock at the age of 19, where he hitchhiked all the way from Ohio to New York just to attend this music festival. So another element of counterculture is the media. Underground press took hold in college towns across America. It reflected the beliefs of the counterculture and the voice of the new left, publishing politically charged material and embracing experimental music and art and sexuality and drugs. Some examples include, over here on the right, we have the Los Angeles Free Press. And in this 1966 article, we see that it's focused on the infamous Watts riots. We also see talking about farm workers, which would have been a big hot button issue in California. And then we also have the Rag, which was based in Austin, Texas. And as you can see here from this cover, it shows a child smoking, something would have, of course, been incredibly controversial and definitely an image that we would have never seen in the 1950s. But it shows how the counterculture was sort of being risque and challenging the norm and sort of what was expected by American society. So we see here how these underground presses were reflecting the voice of the counterculture and promoting their ideas and continuing to challenge mainstream society. So in the 1960s, we also see young people embracing psychedelic drugs like LSD. LSD first became popular in psychological studies. It eventually trickled down into college campuses, and eventually after that it went into society at large. So specifically, the New Left believed that the stagnant American society and lifeless government bureaucracies were going to be remedied by a drug-induced spiritual psychedelic experience. So this prompted such a large number of young people to begin using drugs that it became a crisis issue in Congress. Really, the only way I can think of to relate it is that you could compare its popularity to what we see today in American society with marijuana. Something that's really become a hot button issue because it's so popular and so widespread, but it faces a lot of issues in the government because a lot of people don't think that it's safe. So really we could see that LSD was kind of a similar reaction and experience with society and the government. So the last thing that we're going to be talking about today, ironically, is the popularity of 1960s counterculture and how it led it to be embraced by one of the things it rejected, which is consumerism. So companies realized how popular counterculture had become, and they began targeting young people with their advertisements. So here we have a Volkswagen advertisement that shows a black VW bug and a brightly colored rainbow bug with the statement, "We do our thing, you do yours." So here Volkswagen is specifically targeting the young people of the counterculture because they're trying to show through their ad that they're supportive of the counterculture and their notions of individuality and inclusivity. So a lot of people today actually associate Volkswagen with the 1960s hippies and the counterculture movement. And this is definitely one of the ways that they were able to kind of gain that association and notoriety. We also have this Coca-Cola advertisement here where it shows both white and black young men enjoying Coca-Colas together. So the idea here was to make a political statement. So the United States was in the midst of the civil rights movement, and there were issues of segregation. And after Brown versus Board, we have the attempts to desegregate schools. And so the civil rights movement is taking this on. So through this advertisement, Coca-Cola is showing that it's supporting ending segregation by showing white and black kids mixed together, having a good time, and enjoying themselves. So as you can see, even mainstream society and consumerism were being influenced by the counterculture because that's how popular and widespread it was in America. So we're going to wrap things up with a few final thoughts on the 1960s counterculture. So really, the 1960s counterculture was a reaction to the growing instability of the United States. With events like the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, there was an uncertainty and desire to move away from the conservative ideals, and that's really why we got the counterculture. So in many ways, this counterculture is what we think of when we look back on the 1960s. But it's also important to remember that the counterculture was more than just about music and peace and love. It was a movement meant to create positive changes in a country that was plagued by issues of inequality and injustice. And it's still a movement that whose legacy for desire to change can still be seen in today's turbulent political and social climate. So thank you guys and have a great rest of your day.